Welcome back. We are here today with Stanislav Karapivnik, former U.S. Army officer, born in Donbass and returned to Russia 15 years ago. So thank you very much again for coming back on.
No problem. Thank you. Happy New Year's for everyone, and for those celebrating Orthodox Christmas, it's still another week. So upcoming.
Yeah, Happy New Year's. And well, it seems that we're starting this new year with yet another round of escalation. This attack on Putin's residence I thought was quite interesting because, well, for over the past 4 years, there's been a constant shift in terms of how we should define the rules of this war. So, for example, how deep can the involvement of NATO be within the category of helping Ukraine, and when does one cross into a direct war? This has been shifting as well. We see similarly what are acceptable targets. So we heard that Europeans and Americans have been arguing for a while that the war should be taken to Russian territory in terms of refinery, the nation of Kursk. Of course, it shouldn't be taken to European territory. But importantly, the political leaderships seems to have been largely exempted from this war, and it seems to me that Russia has had some opportunities to take out Zelensky or other parts of the Ukrainian government, but has kind of put this outside what would be considered acceptable targets. So I was wondering, though, how do you see this changing the nature of the war for Russia, but also the diplomatic path?
Well, let's begin with that. Political leadership should be outside the war, and it's only been one-sided. Let's just begin with that. That's flat out. And it's been the side of the Russian side. And this has been coming under more and more criticism, and now the criticism's flying high. It's on the radio stations. People want strikes. They want Zelensky destroyed. They want his people around him destroyed. And this is on commentary this morning. I was in the car listening to it on FM. But people think that, well, at least the West tries to portray that Vladimir Putin is a dictator. Everybody kowtows same line. Far from it. What's scary to the should be scary to the West, if they're any bit IQ higher than a snail, is the fact that Vladimir Putin is holding back a lot of destruction that could easily fall on the West. Anybody else, me included, if I was in his place, I would have been striking much harder and further into the West by this point to get the message across. And if it doesn't get across, call it a warmonger, what have you. But I think that's the problem, is the West has gotten, and Zelensky as part of that West, as the forwardmost part of that West, has gotten very comfortable. They're going to be exempt from everything, no matter what they do. And they continue up the ante to the point where they're going to get hit, and they're going to get hit hard, and it could easily escalate into a nuclear conflict, in which case Europe will be just exterminated. But for the simple reason is, it doesn't take much for Europe to go into a radioactive hellhole, because Europe is very compact. So if Russia was to strike only the American bases that have nuclear weapons on them, the heavy bombs, the glider bombs, that alone would be enough to cover most of Europe in nuclear fallout. It's just a fact of geography. America, Russia have huge open areas, large distances between cities. Europe is extremely compact population-wise. So any hit in Germany will have fallout all the way up into Scotland and Ireland, guaranteed. I mean, we saw that in Chernobyl. When Chernobyl blew, and by the way, the Ukrainians, aka the European, well, I won't say Europeans. I hate saying that. We own a third of Europe. We were in Europe long before as R1A Hopla group. We were there long before the R1Bs, and the R1Bs are the Germans. So we own a third of Europe. We have been here longer than the Germans have been here, and the Scandinavians and many other nationalities. Maybe the Celts are here longer than us. So I'm not going to say Europe. That's just very incorrect. The European Union and NATO. As we saw when Chernobyl blew, the fallout reached Scotland. And for 10 years, the Scots were told not to graze their cattle up in the highlands, or their sheep in this case, up in the highlands, because it was radioactive fallout that was building up in the moss and other organic matter. And that was just from a nuclear power plant that never went critical, by the way. It never went critical because 3 men sacrificed their lives went underneath the nuclear power plant and manually drained the water reserves. Because if it had gotten in there, if it had melted all the way down, there would have been a massive steam explosion that would have covered much of Central and Eastern Europe and probably gotten much more into Western Europe. And the West is trying to do this again on purpose with attacks on the Zaporozhye power plant, with previous attacks on the Kursk power plant. So the West seems to be absolutely the European Union's leadership, with a few exceptions. The Austro-Hungarian Empire seems to have the only sanity left in the EU, the modern EU. The rest of them don't seem to understand where this is going. So they have tried several occasions to attack directly Vladimir Vladimirovich. There was if we remember, in 2022 or 23, there was a drone that flew in and hit the Kremlin. It's just that the anti-aircraft systems were upgraded heavily all around the edges of Moscow and internally with Panzer systems, and the big rocket systems are held externally. There's been several assassinations, flat-out assassinations, including civilian casualties outside of the assassination target, and of civilians too. While we were at it, of poets, of Dugin's daughter. Other people have been assassinated. Journalists have been murdered by the Western regime in Ukraine. The number of journalists that have been killed is innumerable. In fact, the journalists no longer wear press badges. They don't wear press badges. They don't wear blue, the dark blue that journalists normally wear, because that makes them target number one for the Western regime that is in Kyiv. So this is not a first time. The question is, how long will Moscow continue to not retaliate in a full manner? Because the voices of criticism inside of Russia are very loud. And what the West doesn't seem to understand is, believe you me, if they ever get rid of Vladimir Vladimirovich, they're going to be regretting every second that comes after it, and there won't probably be that many seconds, because the people that are going to take power afterwards are going to make them extinct. There are very hard wing people waiting in the wings are going to come after it, and that's going to be revenge. And it's going to be revenge not on Ukraine. It's going to be revenge on the rest of the EU and NATO countries involved in this.
Well, another area, though, where we seem to be moving towards not just an intensification of the front lines, but also further escalation, even widening the war, would be the attacks on different energy and maritime infrastructure. That is, we see that the targets, of course, of the energy infrastructure goes a bit both ways. That is, Ukraine and NATO are targeting Russian energy, not just through sanction, but also attacks on refineries, now also attacks on civilian vessels. And as we saw in the Mediterranean, it's hard to imagine that, of course, Ukrainians acted alone. This seems highly unlikely, but of course, the Russians are also going after Ukrainian energy and ports to reduce Ukraine's capabilities to attack in the Black Sea. What do you see now being the strategy on the Russian sides? Because I heard many warnings coming out of Russia that if its assets are attacked in the Black Sea, then the natural reaction would be to sever Ukraine from the Black Sea. But how are you reading all of these attacks occurring now, especially in the Odessa region? Because it's not just the energy infrastructure. We see the ports, bridges. It's quite, it's been very, I guess, defining of the past 2 months.
Well, let's begin with the fact that this isn't Ukraine attacking. There may be a Ukrainian somewhere in the group. This is the UK. Flat out, this is British intelligence. This is British drones, even if they slap made in Ukraine on those drones. What's interesting is some of the targets have been hit. So the Turks have been made to look fools because shipping is being hit inside their exclusive economic zone. One of the ships that was sunk was actually carrying sunflower oil. Not sure how much of an ecological disaster that will be, but it's not fuel, at least. So we'll see. Maybe fish eat sunflower oil. But there was a lot of it that was leaked. So luckily, the 2 oil tankers that were hit were empty. They were coming in for fueling. But the interesting is they were heading. First of all, they were under third country flags. They were heading toward Novorossiysk, and the damage in Novorossiysk is interesting even more because this wasn't Russian facilities that were hit. This was the Caspian Transit Consortium that was hit. Earlier this year in the summer, their offices were hit by Ukrainian drones. Another port facility of theirs was hit. And this time, their loading facility was hit and destroyed. It's no longer it's not capable of being fixed. And who owns the CTC? Well, Russia does have a small stake in the CTC, but the CTC is owned first and foremost by Kazakhstan, who has been putting their behinds on two seats. We'll be friendly with Russia and we'll hold all the sanction regimes too, somewhere in between. Oh, and we'll help feed Ukraine. Well, you get what you get when you help feed Ukraine. Turkey got the same thing. So now they can't export the majority of their oil because that's where most of their oil went. So they're losing billions. It may bankrupt the government because that government literally does live off of oil and gas. Who else owns that? Oh, the U.S. owns that. So American assets have now been destroyed by the British. I'm not sure how much of how much of a conflict that's going to cause, but I'm sure Americans weren't too thrilled to find out that their facilities that they helped pay for are now longer operable and will not be operable in any of the near future, which cuts down into American oil imports and American revenues. Interestingly enough. So I'm sure that's probably fit into Trump's position at least somewhat, because Trump does represent the oil lobby as well. He hears from them and he represents them. They are powerful in the U.S. What else has been hit? So a Chinese tanker has been hit, and that was in the Mediterranean heading to Russia to fuel up in Russia. And at this point now we're starting to hit the really, it's no longer just Russia being drawn into this war, but the Europeans, because let's admit it, I mean, where the Western Central Europeans are doing this, it's not the Ukrainians. Unless the Ukrainians have free travel with weaponized equipment through Greece. We're talking about Greece, more likely is where these drones came from. How do you find a tanker in the middle of the sea to bring a drone in before its fuel reserves go? Satellites. You have satellite data. If it's not the U.S. giving the satellite data, the EU has more than a few satellites over the area, including the UK, that are given that can give live satellite feeds where these tankers are located. Again, it's one thing if it's in a port; it's a whole different thing. It's out to sea. Sea is a big place. People don't realize that oftentimes when they look at a map and see, oh, see, there's a map, there's a little tanker about icon there. Yes, but that's millions of square kilometers of water. Try finding that with a drone, especially a surface drone, and trying to find it. Let alone even the air drones. The air drones that were used are not that long distance capable. So they're not going to be hovering around looking for this tanker out in the open sea for very long. And they came in hard in basically a swarm outfit. So what the Russian government has already said is for all tankers coming into Russia to reflag to Russian flags. So far, they've been hitting third country flags. Reflag Russian flags, that's an act of war against Russia. Go ahead and hit us. If it's a British, then it's a declaration of war by the British. If it's Bulgaria doing it or Romania doing it, it's a declaration of war by Bulgaria and Romania on the high seas. So we'll see how that works.
But it did make me want to ask you about the U.S. position. How do you make sense of the U.S. position in these negotiations? Because Trump is, of course, famous for going a bit back and forth, and it also seems a bit bizarre, the U.S. position, because now the U.S. is seemingly the main negotiator trying to bring this war to an end. But it was the U.S. that pushed the Europeans back in 2008 on offering future membership to Ukraine. It was the U.S. who took the lead in toppling Yanukovych in 2014. It was the U.S. that took the lead in undermining the Minsk peace agreement and then the Istanbul talks. And today it's the U.S. generals doing most of the war planning. Ukraine is full of CIA agents. It's the U.S. intelligence agencies giving the targeting, primarily using American weapons. And this is still a U.S.-led proxy war, irrespective of Trump trying to give it over to Biden. So yet Trump is the mediator here. He might be genuine, though, that he wants this war to end as he sees a disaster, or he could just be trying to outsource it to the Europeans. But even as he mediates, though, the sanctions on countries like India are being imposed in efforts to cripple the Russian economy, and he either ignores or assists the Europeans in attacks on Russia. So there's even the civilian vessels. So I mean, you are a former U.S. Army officer. How do you make sense of the U.S. position in this? Well, let's call it a diplomatic circus, because this it doesn't feel very genuine to me that if they would want to shut this thing down, they could. And I do understand that they don't want to give up the pressure yet against Russia, as they can use this as leverage in any negotiations. But still, it's been a year of the Trump administration, and they're still leading this war. So what are we looking at here?
For future historians, say in 150 years, 200 years, before they start studying these last 5 years, and probably or last, maybe even longer, if you really want to go back to where it starts, and the next couple of years where it goes, I would highly suggest binging on Monty Python's Flying Circus, because this is basically like the most absurd episode of Monty Python's Flying Circus. For those that haven't watched this, maybe I'm dating myself, but I highly suggest watching some reruns and then watching the news. It will make much more sense. The absurd of the absurd is what we have from the West in general. Anybody with half a intellectual node in their head would have figured out that one of the biggest targets of all of this was the European Union to begin with. The destruction of the European Union, the willful self-destruction of the European Union. And that's exactly what we have.
Well, the U.S. playing all sides is a common theme, though. In 1941, before Harry Truman took the presidency, there's this quote he had in the New York Times where he said that, if the Germans are winning, we should help the Russians. If the Russians are winning, we should help the Germans. And that way let them kill each other, as many as possible. And this is kind of as long as both are weakened, we win. And again, and it's not exactly the same now, but the logic is still the same. You can destroy, for example, Nord Stream, you weaken the Europeans, and in their weakness, make them more dependent on the US, make them more obedient. I mean, look where the EU is now. 20 years ago, in terms of GDP, there was some parity between the US and the EU. Now, there's nothing. What remains of a deindustrializing Europe is being now lured over to the United States with all these subsidies, and it's quite remarkable. And as the Europeans are allowed the privilege of buying American weapons to fight a war, which the Americans were the main one pushing for, all the Americans want in return is for Europeans to buy American energy, much, much more expensive. And what remains of money should be invested in the United States, as per a deal the EU had to sign with Trump on his golf course, given that the EU didn't have any leverage. So there is, and again, this hardly falls under a conspiracy theory when Trump himself comes out and says the EU is worse than China, and he hates nothing more than China, seemingly, so that would be the European. So it is quite remarkable, but it does beg the question, what do you think is how do you interpret the European position? Because this is a very strange thing for me, because the Europeans, again, they're the one, as said before, resisted the US push towards this disaster in 2008 when they warned Bush that don't offer membership to Ukraine. First of all, there's only 20% of them who want it, and it's going to be war. Angela Merkel said this. This will be interpreted by Moscow as a declaration of war. And the predictable thing happened. It blew up in our faces. We have a war. We're losing that war. The U.S. is really sees what's written on the wall, so they're backing out. Not completely, obviously, but handing over responsibility to the Europeans and try to make some money of it as they outsource it. It's just, and there's no course correction. It's quite shocking. And I always feel like I should make some excuses for the EU, but after what they did to Colonel Jacques Beau of the Swiss Army, if you read his books, watched his interviews, he just relies on Western sources to give the best analysis, which was his job as a colonel. He did the intelligence analysis, and then, based on interpreting reality as it is, advocates for the best policies. His assessments have been correct. No one can catch him on any of the facts or the analysis he does. And the policies, therefore, he recommended would have kept us away from this war. It would have saved Europe. It would have saved Ukraine. That's not what the Europeans did. Yet they sanctioned him. He can't travel. They seized his bank accounts. A colonel which used to work with NATO. What? This is just, it's so dark. I mean, for me, this is a big nail in the coffin of the EU. And they did this to themselves. It's shocking. Anyways, on that not so happy note, thank you very much for taking the time. I know you're very busy there in the holidays ahead of New Year's and Orthodox Christmas. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And I hope, I do hope this year brings sanity. What's the Chinese animal this time? The horse? Hope the year of the horse, or the stallion, whichever it is, brings a lot more sanity to Europe than has been for the last 3 or 4 years. So we'll live and see. But, hope for the best, prepare for the worst.
大家好，我是主播周玉琴。很多的朋友告诉我们，太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌帮助了睡眠品质。原版的太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌，它添加有超级食物羽衣甘蓝，健康再加分。而有睡眠困扰的朋友们，赶快选择蓝色包装这一款晚安加强版，绝对是更有感。每日克菲尔，时刻美好 ，Good Feel Good。请上快点购为健康下单，而且要记得输入推荐代码，有额外的折扣优惠。太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌基础版、晚安加强版新包装改版，内容不变，抽取更方便。要吃就吃最好的。